and welcome to this second episode of Mint Lounge Conversations presented in association with the Malaysian Palm Oil Council. I'm your host Gautam Srinivasan. Previously, you heard from industry leaders on the trends shaping the Indian palm oil market, its role in India's vegetable oil industry, and action areas regarding imports. Today, we focus on addressing some misconceptions associated with palm oil and its consumption via views from leading medical practitioners and academicians from the perspective of food and nutrition and opinions from experts on palm oil. Our panel today features Dr. Pramod Khosla, professor at the Department of Nutrition and Food Science at Wayne State University. Dr. Khosla has been working on diet and lipoprotein metabolism for almost 30 years. With him is Dr. Meena Mehta, retired associate professor in the Food Science and Nutrition Department at the Dr. B.M. Nanavati College of Home Science. And with us also is Professor Dr. Ketan K. Mehta, an experienced consultant physician, cardiopulmonologist and diabetologist who's also a co-investigator in a number of research studies, and also Bhavna Shah, who's the country head for India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka at the Malaysian Palm Oil Council. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this talk. Now, let us first broadly understand the importance of diet or nutrition for keeping good health and how oils and fats play a role in that. So let's go around the panel to hear your views on this, starting with Dr. Khosla.
Thank you. Well, when it comes to diet, we all know that in your diet, you need various components, and those components we can basically classify as macronutrients, which we need in large quantities, and those are fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And then we also have very important components, which we call micronutrients, which we need in very, very small quantities, and these include vitamins and minerals. In order to have good health, research has established over the years that you need a certain mix of all of these. You have to have those micronutrients because they're absolutely essential in the diet. And then within those macronutrients, some of them you have to have in the diet and some the body makes. So when it comes to fat, most research over the last 30, 40 years says something that your total energy, your calories from these nutrients, for fat, it should be anything from 15 to 30%, 15 to 40%. It depends on where you are, depends on how active you are. And in order to get that much fat, we have numerous fats and oils at our disposal. So we basically have to have a diet formulation in which we have fat providing something like 15 to 30% of total energy. Protein comes from various sources. We need a certain amount, and that requirement is usually based on how much you weigh. It's based on your size, essentially. And pretty much the rest comes from carbohydrate. Most diets that we consume, humans, carbohydrates are the bulk. So they will provide something like 50 to 60% of total energy. In places like India and Southeast Asia, this can be even higher because we eat a lot of wheat, we eat a lot of rice. Now, in the last 20, 30 years, the research has looked at whether fat is more important when it comes to health or carbohydrate. Now, of course, we need them both. But depending on the specific disease state, whether you're talking heart disease, whether you're talking diabetes, there may be one component which has a greater influence than the other. And I'm sure we will get into that later on in this discussion. So the main thing is there are various components in the diets that we have to have. There is a recommended mix, and the idea is to maintain and obtain that mix as best we can from the foods that are available. And of course, in different cultures, we have different foods. So it's a question of mix and match.
All right. So in that mix that you talk about, Dr. Meena, I'd like your response. How important does oil play a role?
When it comes to oil, one has to be very careful in choosing the right kind of oil for right kind of population. As Dr. Khosla mentioned about the diet and all, along with the diet, we have to be very careful. 15 to 30%, depending on the activity of a person. Also, oil has to be selected, and oil has a multiple role to do also in the body. Oil is required by the body, fats and oils both. We cannot just say it's not necessary at all. It's a myth. Oils and fats should not be there in the diet because one has to take enough amount of oils and fat every day. It's not for one time at all.
All right. And speaking of addressing myths, I'll ask this question to Dr. Ketan. I just read a recent article on the fact that, for obesity, it's been said that it's what you eat versus how much you eat, which is more of an importance. So as we see the science around food and nutrition and diet, it's ever evolving. So what's your view, doctor, on, from a perspective of diet and nutrition, how to have the right mix, the right balance, as Dr. Khosla said, and the role that oils and fats play in that?
Yeah, it has been rightly said by you because there are two aspects. One is the quantum of food, so that is the quantity versus quality of food what we consume. That is the very, very crucial fact. And when we talk about the balanced nutrition, it is balancing in all the aspects. So it is not just the quantum of food, but what quality of food what we are consuming, which is important. And I would just add on to whatever the previous two faculties have said, that when we are talking about balancing the aspects, besides looking into these macronutrients, we need to take into consideration what we call as micronutrients, which is comprising of vitamins, minerals, trace elements, and which should be in adequate quantity. And that there is a role of balanced nutrition, which will keep us healthy. And I would add over here as a clinician, it has been stated that the clinician of the 21st century will treat the disease with medicines, but they can prevent the disease with nutrition. And that is the role of nutrition. Thank you.
Absolutely. As they say, prevention is better than cure. And I'll come to Bhavna for a response to what you've heard from the experts. Considering in these pandemic times, healthcare and nutrition has taken a more important role when people are paying it more serious attention. So, in that context, the importance of diet and nutrition becomes even more important, and an understanding of how oils and fats play an important role in maintaining that balance. What's your initial thought on that?
That's right, Gautam. Like my learned colleagues have already said, oils and fats play a very important role in fulfilling our nutritional needs. Now, you see, in India, an estimated of about 22 million people, 22% people are said to be below poverty line. And it's very imperative that they get suitable nutrition within their scarce resources. So, according to FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, so much about 15% population is considered to be malnourished. So, oils and fats, and especially I'll talk about palm oil, they provide that necessary resources to alleviate the issues of malnutrition. Now, to give you an example, according to WHO data, an estimated number of visually impaired people in India is about 62 million. And according to WHO, an estimated 2.8 million preschool age children are at risk of nutritional blindness. Now, everyone knows in scientific community, palm oil is rich in vitamin A, E, beta carotene, which provides nourishment to eyes. So this is my initial 2 cents
Mhm.
about the role of nutrition and palm oil to fulfill the requirements.
All right, we'll expand on the last point that you mentioned. But speaking of nourishment, the role of palm oil for cooking, I'll come to Dr. Meena for this. Dr. Meena, what's your view on using palm oil for cooking? What are the benefits?
Yeah, it's a versatile oil and it has immense benefits. I mean, just to start off, it has a high stability as far as frying is concerned, which Indian population loves or everybody loves across the globe. Basically, it's a fruit oil coming from palm fruit, fleshy oil with melting point also 35 degrees centigrade and all. Plus, it has the benefit of best of both the world. In a sense, it's a semi-solid by nature, partly saturated, partly PUFA and MUFA also. So it's a versatile for many applications, daily cooking, as my previous colleague has also said, Dr. Bhavna Shah also said and spelled out about malnutrition. It's being used very effectively. Apart from that, it has a good stability. When the fried foods are being there on the shelf, it has a longer shelf life also compared to other oils. Thirdly, it's having a neutral taste and flavor. So whatever infuses masalas or the condiments, we are trying to add it up in a particular dish or a crispy cut, what we say. It definitely keeps the taste and flavor of that also along with it. That is why it's most preferred oil across the globe for particular purpose, even for bakery purpose.
Mm.
We can use this particular oil because it does not produce any trans fat also
All
because
right.
of its semi-solid nature. Otherwise, one has to transfer the vegetable ghee kind of thing, keeping in mind, and hydrogenation process has to take place, which can produce or lead to trans fatty acids. So it's free of trans fat acid and it's a gift of nature, I would say, to mankind.
All right. Then, Dr. Meena, what explains this negative perceptions that some have, in the sense that palm oil's impact on health? It has been a topic of debate. It has been described as unhealthy and hazardous by some. So, how factually correct is this idea?
No, it's not unhealthy at all. Any kind of oil, the best of the best oil, when taken in excess amount, it can harm a person's health. But when it comes to the palm oil, we can use it in a limited amount with uh, not to use, rather, I would say here, reuse or refry in the same oil. Otherwise, it can lead to many cardiovascular problem or other health problem also. Whereas palm oil used in daily cooking will not lead to any kind of health issue. It's absolute myth.
All right. Let me bring in Dr. Khosla for his views on in exploring palm oil's effects on health. Dr. Khosla, is it a myth that high saturated fat content of palm oil boosts bad LDL cholesterol and triglycerides? How factually correct is this information?
Oh, that, Gautam, is a question which people have been looking at for the last 60 years, and we still do not have an answer. So let me sort of backtrack. Starting in the late 50s, there was some early evidence that came from a worker called Ansel Keys, who was working in the Mediterranean. He was looking at the diets of people in various countries. And essentially what he found is that if you look at the total fat content in the diet, specifically the saturated fat in the diet, there was a relationship with heart disease. So from there, this perception started that high saturated fat leads to heart disease. Fast forward over 60 years, why do we get heart disease? Heart disease, one of the contributors is what we call LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol. And LDL is essentially, it's a bus inside the body which transports cholesterol from the liver to various tissues. So the idea is if you have high levels of LDL, it can cause damage because it can end up in the arterial wall and it can cause blockages, which can lead to heart attacks. And conversely, you have HDL, which is another bus, if you like, and that takes cholesterol from various tissues back to the liver where it can be excreted. So the idea is if you have high levels of HDL, that is beneficial. So once people started to look specifically at LDL and HDL, then what has happened is the data has changed over the last 40 years. We now realize that fat per se may not be the biggest culprit when it comes to impacting LDL. It impacts LDL for sure, it impacts HDL, but it may not be the biggest culprit. The biggest culprit may actually be carbohydrate. We eat lots and lots of carbohydrate, but we now know that there are two types of carbohydrates for research discussion. One is very simple carbohydrates like sugar. And their impact on LDL is different from complex carbohydrates like your starches. And the consensus seems to be that these simple carbohydrates, these simple sugars, what you find in typically, beverages like soft drinks, they're the ones that actually are bigger contributors to this change in LDL and HDL. So the perception that it's fat has been there for almost 50, 60 years. And once you've established something and you've taught it from school all the way up to university level, that perception is difficult to change. But the newer research, definitely in the last 20 years, has shifted the focus to discussion of carbohydrates. And one of the obvious bits of evidence for that is we've been telling people to cut out fat. We've been telling people to reduce fat. Yet, especially in Western world, obesity has gone up. People have reduced fat intake, but obesity has gone up. Why? Because they reduced fat, but they replaced it with carbohydrate. They ended up eating more carbohydrate, and one of the consequences is obesity, which itself leads to various chronic diseases. So the debate is continuing. The research is ongoing. In fact, just a few days ago, a paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition began to explore this in more detail. There's lots and lots of evidence that carbohydrates may be the biggest contributor, and specifically simple carbohydrates. In the Indian diet, we have lots and lots of simple carbohydrates. I'm not saying fat or saturated fat is not a problem. No. We have always said that the saturated fat in the diet should be approximately less than 10% of your total energy. And most diets, it is less than 10% of your total energies nowadays. It used to be 12, 13, 14% in the US in the late 60s. Now it's around 10, 11%. So we've always said saturated fat, as long as it doesn't exceed a certain amount, it's fine. And then going back to Dr. Mina's point, anything in excess is a problem. So in a long answer, but the simple answer to your question, yes, it is a myth, but the data is now saying that this myth may not be rooted in real science. The science is evolved. And as far as we're concerned right now, most people who research in this area will not be looking just at fat. They're now actually looking at the total diet, because we know there are many components in the diet that can impact LDL and HDL levels.
Absolutely. And as you say, simple versus complex carbohydrates, that also plays a very important part in this mix of assessing the impact that it has. And considering the diets in India itself are disparate and varied from the north to south, east to west, it'll be interesting to see what some of the data from there brings about and brings a change in the discussion. But in simple terms, Dr. Mina, comparing palm oil to other types of oil, for the viewing audience, how does palm oil compare to other types of oil in terms of the health aspect? What's your view on that? If you could give us a simple clarification there.
Yeah, thank you. As far as health is concerned, we need to take in total. We cannot isolate into different parts. We have to consider the total balanced diet. It's not one component of or part of a basic my plate or something. And when it comes to the palm oil, we have to be very clear about it. Any kind of fat, when we consume, it has to be used judiciously. Then only it has the best benefit as far as health is concerned. And the diet, on an average, it should be a wholesome in a sense. It should have variety. It should have wholesomeness. And plus, we need to do little bit of physical activity also to have the best health.
All right. Bhavna, let me bring you in at this point in time. You've heard Dr. Khosla, Dr. Meena, and Dr. Ketan speak about palm oil, and the debate is itself evolving, where what we thought earlier was the culprit is not, and they're finding new sources. So if palm oil holds so much nutritional value and the health benefits associated with it, in your opinion, why is palm oil faced with this perception disconnect versus other oils?
Good question, Gautam. You may call it a Veblen effect. Like in economics, we learned that anything we consider which is cheap, it's considered not good quality, not superior. So a lot of negative connotations seem to be attached to palm oil because it is cheap. But paradoxically, that is one of the major attributes of palm oil, which brings it within the reach of major segment of the population. Now, this myth that palm oil is inferior to other oils has got nothing to do with health and nutrition, like you heard from our learned colleagues. Uh, it's actually more social and economic aspects that has given rise to this myth. If in fact it had got anything to do with health and nutrition, palm oil would not have become a major edible oil consumed in several developing countries. Um, in India, palm oil only accounts for about 40% of total oils and fats consumed. But in fact, in many developing countries, palm oil consumption accounts for about 80 to 90% of oils and fats consumed. So this status would not have been achieved if really there were some health and nutrition concerns attached to palm oil. And why this myth? This myth has been propagated to a large extent in the Indian subcontinent.
Mm.
And going back in history, in the previous century, palm oil imports were canalized for distribution through PDS, public distribution system, or we commonly call them ration shops. Now, this meant that palm oil usage was aimed for economically backward section of the population. I'm talking about the times when we didn't have OGL, Open General License, when everything was, controlled by government. Individuals or companies could not directly import. And during that time, when we had major shortage, the then government decided to import palm oil to help the vulnerable section of society. And unfortunately, there was no marketing, no branding. Now, government importing and trying to distribute, it was big deal itself. That itself was a big budget thing. So so unfortunately, palm oil came into India like an orphan. That's what I commonly tell my friends. So palm oil came to be known as a poor man's oil.
Mm.
And this stigma has remained attached to palm oil even today. An oil which was meant to fulfill the consumption and nutritional needs of the economical backward population achieved the dubious distinction of being labeled a poor man's oil.
Mm.
Now, that fact that generally palm oil is cheaper than other competing oils has also not helped the image.
In a way, it's peer pressure, right? So if it is dubbed a poor man's oil, as you say so, then it gains a broader talking point among others, saying I would prefer something else, which not, because especially if you're status or status conscious or something, you don't want to be seen purchasing something which others might think, oh, looks like you're hit the hard times. But that's a good point that you mentioned right there. Let's see who else wants to add on this. I think Dr. Meena is wanting to add a point to this. Dr. Meena?
Since it has been termed as poor man's oil, then why all processed food companies are using the palm oil in their products? Because processed food cannot be afforded by the poor man, because it has got its own versatility plus the beneficial effects also. That is why it has been added, and one can easily have palm oil in the prudent diet. There is no harm in it.
That's a very good point that you bring up. That's something for folks watching at home to consider. If you think that it's not working, look at the broader business universe and how they use it, and you can get a cue from it. That's a good point, Dr. Meena. Dr. Khosla, you have something to add to this as well?
Yeah, so it goes back to Bhavna's point. This is all about supply and demand. If you look at the US, when I go to my supermarket, every single oil is available there. And the one that is produced the most in the US, soybean oil, it's the cheapest. If you want something more, exotic or from abroad, like canola, olive, it's more expensive because there's less of it. So that is also a basic fact in this equation.
It's positioning. It's all about positioning. What appears today as not hip, you can position it as a new age food, superfood, and then you'll see it flying off the shelves. But considering this point, Bhavna, Malaysia being one of the largest producers of palm oil in the world, what steps is the Malaysian Palm Oil Council taking to address these negative perceptions around palm oil?
The very fact that we are sitting here and talking about palm oil shows the sincerity of Malaysia to dispel such notions. Although the oil palm tree originated from West Africa and was not endemic to Malaysia, Malaysia had set up various research facilities to conduct studies to dispel the negativity that surrounds palm oil and promote the health, nutritional, commercial properties of palm oil. Besides commercial applications, the research conducted is to bring to the forefront for the knowledge of the medical and nutrition fraternity how palm oil can improve the lifestyle of people in the fast changing world. And such research is conducted by not only the experts in Malaysia, but by relevant independent professionals all across the globe. And the outcome of such research and findings is disseminated by MPOC, Malaysian Palm Oil Council, through its various offices across the globe. Steps have been taken to improve the understanding of palm oil, enhancing its application, elucidating its numerous strengths and benefits. We at MPOC try to uphold the good name of Malaysian palm oil by closing the gap between the issues of perception, allegations, and reality of palm oil.
All right. Let me bring in Dr. Ketan. Dr. Ketan, let's look at the plus side. Bhavna had earlier mentioned about vitamin E. So, what are the health benefits of vitamin E, of which palm oil is a major source?
Yeah, Gautam, you rightly brought it. In fact, there is enough data which shows that the palm oil is the richest source of vitamin E. And especially when we talk, there are two components to it. One is tocopherol and another is tocotrienol. Now, which tocotrienol, which has got more health benefits, and whatever abstract we get it from the palm oil is predominantly tocotrienol. Now, looking at the health benefits of tocotrienol, which are in abundance, it won't be it. I mean, if I start eliminating and showing all the properties, it would be like a big session. But to make it shorter, let's talk about any properties which is related to what we call metabolic syndrome, where the person gets diabetes, lipid abnormalities. So it has a role in blood sugar control. It has a role in lipid lowering. It has a role in controlling metabolic syndrome. It has also a role as anti-atherosclerosis. So whatever the blockages which come, it helps creating and reducing those blockages. It has also a role as an anti-aging properties. It has a role in terms of anti-malignancy or anti-cancer cells, because it has a overall what we call as antioxidant properties, which prevents the degeneration or degradation of the cells. And that is where it has a innumerable properties which are having a positive impact in the health. And probably, if we really see, there are very few natural sources of vitamin E, and of which if somebody has to consume it coming through a dietary sources, where obviously oil is also one of the element coming through palm oil, that would be most welcome. Thank you.
All right. So, would you call it nature's best secret? I'm sure a lot of the folks who are watching would have never heard of tocotrienols. So, considering its uses and its use as an antioxidant, one among many, would you consider it something, something to be seen as a great secret which people didn't know, but they should know more about?
I fully agree. In fact, I would say, I'm sure, Gautam, you must have checked your vitamin B12 level and vitamin D level. Now, how many of us were aware about it a decade back or 12, 15 years back? Suddenly, what has happened? The laboratory started checking those levels, and you started realizing what is the importance of vitamin D and B12. Now, today, what is happening is, if you have to check vitamin E, there are only 2 labs in the entire country which are checking it. So it is not freely available, and that is how people are not much aware about it, that what will happen if there is a vitamin E deficiency. But once the lab starts doing vitamin E, and then you realize, oh, there is a large population which are not having adequate vitamin E level, and then there will be a commercial preparations which will come plentiful, the noise level which will come for vitamin E, and that is where there is imbalance. So I'm sure you are going to see in the next 1 decade, there is an ample of information coming once the vitamin E level assays will be available to the society. Thank you.
All right. So let's wrap up the conversation by getting a key message from each one of you to the viewing audience on what you think is important for them to know when it comes to, say, the use of palm oil and, of course, its effect on health. So, Dr. Khosla, just a broad message, key takeaway from this conversation that you've heard for the viewing audience on what they should be, how they should approach this debate.
When it comes to fats and oils, my message has always been simple. As long as your diet is meeting the requirements for good health, the various components, it really, to me, doesn't matter what the source of the fat is. It can be anything. And living in the US, I'm going to have access to a certain fat. If I live in the UK, I have access to a certain fat. Living in India, I have access to a certain fat. So that is not the issue. It's not a question of one being better than the other, as long as your total diet is appropriate. So you can mix and match. We've actually done various calculations in our research over the years. And the simple rule of thumb that we have is 50 grams of palm oil. I can tell almost anybody 50 grams of palm oil in your diet is not an issue. Now, of course, you will have to look at if you're consuming more. That's just a simple rule of thumb that 50 grams of fat, and in most cultures, half of your dietary fat, if it's from palm oil, you don't even have to think twice. Now, the other aspect about the tocotrienols and the vitamin E, that's a little bit more nuanced. And even us, people who've been working in this, we tend to forget this. We've been discussing palm oil. We've mentioned, beta carotene. We mentioned night blindness. We've talked about vitamin E, but we haven't said red palm oil. But we ourselves know there is a distinction. So when you talk about beta carotene blindness, we're not talking palm oil. We're talking red palm oil, which is rich in carotenoids. When Ketan talks about tocotrienols, he's talking about tocotrienols extracted from palm oil, not eating palm oil because they have tocotrienols. If you eat palm oil, you probably need kilograms of the quantities in order to get the tocotrienols, which have benefit. So the research on the tocotrienols is exciting. It's getting to a point where we will have probably a lot more advances because, in order to get to the stage where you can recommend this routinely for humans, whether we're talking vitamin D, B12, you need the research, which is coming. So the simple message has always been a balanced diet with ample exercise. And what's the source of your fat component or carbohydrates? That is going to depend on what you have. And as we teach our students, ultimately, it depends on how much change there is in your pocket. Because
Absolutely.
Really, your diet is going to be based on what you can afford.
Absolutely.
Okay.
As we mentioned earlier, this is an honest and open conversation. So it's good to hear all sides, all points of view on this, and a very important message there. Dr. Meena, your key message for the viewing audience as a key takeaway from this discussion?
I would like to just say, live the life to fullest extent, enjoy the nature's gift for everybody. I mean, no barrier of socio-economic class or anything, and live the life. And secondly, walk a while, then you have a smiles and smiles for the life, along with
Absolutely.
the farmer.
Absolutely. The simplest phrase, health is wealth.
Yes.
Dr. Ketan, your summary statement for this discussion?
Definitely nutrition, as we have started with, that forms the cornerstone of maintaining a well-being. And a good nutrition, we have realized the value of in maintaining the immunity in the current COVID pandemic, which everybody has stressed upon and realized that how important is. So to have and to keep away from doctors, you must have definitely a good, nutritious, balanced diet. Whichever oil you are consuming, use it in a right proportion, right way. And again, I would add to it, when it comes to oil, we would definitely still put it, no single oil is perfect. Every oil has its own plus and minus. And now the current trend is to you go for a blending of oils where more than one oil is used over there. Thank you.
All right. So it's not just an apple a day that keeps the doctor away.
Absolutely.
Bhavna, lots of talking points discussed. Refine it for us as a key message that you would like the audience to hear.
First of all, fantastic inputs from everyone here. It was good learning for me too. I have been sitting here and privy to a lot of fake messages going around. So it was a pleasure to listen to actual experts and not the WhatsApp university experts. So, talking about fake messages, there are so many fake messages, and so it's like, difficult to catch hold and share your thoughts. So, my only point is for everyone watching this, you may have emotional preference, like let's say this is my family traditional recipe and my grandmother used to prepare in a certain way in certain oil, and that's what I choose. That's perfectly all right. You may have an economical preference that this is what I can afford and this is what I prefer. That's perfectly acceptable. You may have a taste preference that I like a particular oil for a certain taste or no taste for that matter. That's also fine. But just fake messages for the sake of it and forwarding without even having an understanding. Like I mentioned, the statistics are numbing. People are dying of malnourishment, undernutrition, and we are, coming up with these controversies for economical reasons. Makes no sense. So it has tremendous benefits and good characteristics. You can have palm oil, you cannot have palm oil. That's your choice. We are not trying to influence your choice. We're only sharing the techno economic information, unbiased information to our audiences. My only take home message is the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. Thank you.
All right. Trust but verify. I guess we could distill the talking points there. If you want to know more about what you're eating and how it impacts your health, it would be important for you to go to verifiable and trustworthy sources of information and get your source of information from there, and you take a decision then. Well, we hope you've got as much information as you could receive on this topic today, but there's lots more to discuss, but we've run out of time. On that note, it's time to conclude this second episode of the Mint Lounge Conversations presented in association with the Malaysian Palm Oil Council. I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us and sharing their thoughts and insights on clearing some misconceptions around palm oil and its consumption. And of course, thank you to our viewers for tuning in. This is Gautam Srinivasan signing off.